The storm raged outside, and inside the quiet inn of Dusty Creek, an unexpected knock echoed through the silence. When Martha Sullivan opened the door, she found a stranger with a look of deep desperation in his eyes. The request he was about to make would push her to make a choice that would change her life forever. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Martha Sullivan stood at the window of the small, dimly lit inn, staring out at the rain that poured relentlessly from the sky. The town of Dusty Creek had all but forgotten her since her husband John died from the lingering grip of tuberculosis. Word had spread that the illness was contagious, and despite the years that had passed, the town still kept its distance. Her inn, once filled with travelers and laughter, was now quiet. She wiped her hands on her apron, the familiar ache of loneliness settling deep in her bones. The last few months had been especially hard. Business had dried up, and now she spent her days dusting and scrubbing, her thoughts endlessly returning to John and the life they once dreamed of building. The storm outside seemed to mirror her emotions. As the rain pattered against the roof, Martha sighed, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. A glance at the empty chairs and vacant tables made her wonder if anyone would ever come through the door again. Just as she turned back to the kitchen, a sound from the stable caught her attention. It was faint, but unmistakable, something moving, something alive. She hesitated for only a moment before slipping into her worn boots and walking outside, her breath visible in the cool air. The wind whipped through her hair as she made her way toward the stable. There, lying in the hay, was a small figure, a boy, no older than 12. He was ragged, his clothes torn and filthy, and he appeared to be asleep, shivering despite the warmth of the barn. Martha's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts urged her to step away, to ignore him, as the town would surely do. But something about his fragile form made her hesitate. Carefully, she knelt beside him, her fingers brushing against his cold skin. "Hey, little one," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" The boy stirred, slowly blinking his eyes open. His gaze was cautious, wary, as if he had learned to expect little kindness in this harsh world. He didn't speak at first, just sat up and rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the weariness that seemed to haunt him. I'm just trying to stay warm," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Martha's heart tightened at the sight of him, so young, so vulnerable. Despite the town's prejudice and fear, she couldn't bring herself to turn him away. "Come inside," she said, offering him a hand. "I have food and work. I can help you." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with suspicion but also a quiet desperation. After a moment of silence, he nodded. With a gentle tug, she helped him to his feet. As they walked back toward the inn, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that this boy, this stranger, was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Samuel Winchester's boots echoed across the dusty floor of the inn as he stepped inside, his face pale and sweat-slicked. The storm that had been raging outside seemed to have followed him in. He was a man who normally carried himself with confidence, but today there was a noticeable tremor in his hands. His eyes darted around the dimly lit room, locking onto Martha with a look of desperation she hadn't seen in him before. "Martha Sullivan?" he rasped, his voice rough as if even speaking took effort. "I've heard you know a thing or two about remedies." Martha was taken aback by his sudden appearance. She hadn't seen the banker in months, and certainly not like this. Winchester was a powerful man in Dusty Creek, one of the wealthiest, with a reputation for cruelty and a penchant for exploiting anyone who couldn't afford his high rates. She had no love for him, but the sight of him now, sick and disheveled, stirred something in her. "What brings you here, Mr. Winchester?" she asked cautiously, stepping back to give him room. He glanced around the inn, his gaze lingering on the old furniture, the neglected fireplace, and then back to her. "I've been to every doctor from here to Denver and even San Francisco," he said, voice cracking. "None of them can tell me what's wrong. But I hear you might have a solution." Martha didn't speak immediately. She knew well the rumors that had followed her husband's death, and while she had always known that people looked at her with suspicion, there was no denying that her late husband had always done his best to help others. Even so, she wasn't sure how to respond. What could she offer this man who had caused so much pain in this town? "You've heard wrong," she replied, her tone flat. "I'm not a healer." Winchester's eyes narrowed and he took a step closer. "I've heard you've got someone here. A boy, I believe. He's the one I need." Martha's chest tightened. She hadn't mentioned Tommy to anyone. The boy had only just arrived and already she was facing the consequences of opening her door to a stranger. "What do you mean by that?" "I'll pay you," Winchester continued, as if it was the only thing that mattered. $500. If your boy can cure me, I'll pay him that much. Hell, I'll give you 10 times that if he can get rid of whatever sickness I've got." Martha's jaw clenched. She knew Tommy's skills were real. He was the grandson of an Apache healer, but this felt wrong. "You're asking for something that can't be bought." Winchester's laugh was hollow, almost mocking. "You think a child has the power to cure me? I've spent fortunes on the best doctors. I've been to the finest places in the country. This is my last resort." His arrogance made Martha bristle, but there was something more to his words. She glanced towards the kitchen, where she knew Tommy was likely listening from the other room. He had been unusually quiet ever since Martha had welcomed him into her home. Before she could respond, a small voice interrupted from the kitchen doorway. "I'll do it." Martha froze, her heart pounding. She turned to find Tommy standing in the doorway, his eyes steady and unwavering, a calmness about him that belied his age. Winchester turned to face him, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You? A child?" Tommy stood his ground. "I'll cure you, but if I do, you'll pay me $10,000. The banker's face twisted into a cruel smile, disbelief turning to laughter. "10,000? You must be out of your mind." But Tommy didn't flinch. "I'm not joking. I'll cure you, but you'll pay the price." For a moment, there was a silence, broken only by the sound of the storm outside. Winchester's laugh died, and in its place a tension filled the air, one that no amount of money could erase. Samuel Winchester couldn't believe his ears. A child, no older than 12, standing in front of him, demanding $10,000 for curing him. His laugh, which had once echoed confidently in every room of his bank, now sounded hollow and forced. "10,000? He sneered, shaking his head. "You've got to be joking. You're just a boy. Do you even know what I've been through? I've spent fortunes on doctors, real doctors. You think you can cure me with herbs or whatever nonsense you've learned?" Tommy's gaze remained steady. There was no fear, no hesitation in his eyes. For someone so young, he exuded a quiet authority that was unsettling. "I don't need your fortune," Tommy said calmly. "I'll cure you, but it's my price." Martha watched the exchange from the corner of the room, her heart sinking. She had been concerned about Tommy's confidence from the beginning, but seeing him stand up to Winchester, knowing what that man was capable of, filled her with dread. She had seen enough of Winchester's cruelty to know that his threats were not empty. "Fine," Winchester said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'll humor you, cure me, and I'll pay you the 10,000. But when this goes wrong, don't expect me to be forgiving." Tommy nodded without saying another word. He turned and walked toward the small kitchen, where he had been gathering herbs and preparing his remedies. Martha couldn't help but feel a mix of disbelief and admiration. Could this boy really do it? The silence in the room felt oppressive as Tommy worked. He moved with a quiet confidence, selecting a handful of dried herbs from a shelf and mixing them together in a pot. The scent of the herbs filled the room, earthy and unfamiliar. Tommy's hands were steady, his focus absolute. When he returned with the steaming cup of tea, Samuel Winchester stared at it in disbelief. "You're giving me that?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think that's going to fix me?" Tommy didn't respond. Instead, he handed the cup to Winchester, who reluctantly took it. The banker took a long, skeptical sip, his eyes still narrowed as he waited for the expected disappointment. But something unexpected happened. Within moments of swallowing the bitter liquid, Winchester's trembling began to subside. His skin, which had been unnaturally pale, started to regain its color. His breath, which had been shallow and labored, became deeper, more controlled. Martha watched in stunned silence as the man's condition seemed to improve before her eyes. What is this?" Winchester gasped, his voice suddenly tinged with awe. "I told you," Tommy replied, his tone calm. "It's just herbs, but it's the faith that heals you." Winchester didn't seem to know how to respond. His hands, once shaking uncontrollably, were steady. His skin no longer had the sickly hue that had haunted him for so long. He looked up at Tommy with a mix of disbelief and grudging respect. "You did it," he said, still unsure of how to process what had just happened. "But I'm not paying you $10,000, boy." Tommy's eyes narrowed, and a cold sense of finality filled the room. "You will pay me." Winchester stood up abruptly, the initial awe fading into frustration. "I told you I'm not paying you a dime. This was a fluke, a lucky guess." Before Tommy could respond, a soft voice came from behind them. "Mr. Winchester, you can't back out of this," Martha said firmly, stepping into the room. She had seen enough of the banker's lies and cruelty to know that he wouldn't honor his word. "You made a promise, and Tommy deserves his due." Winchester's eyes flicked to her, narrowing with a sneer. "What are you going to do about it? You're just a widow with nothing to her name." Tommy stepped in front of Martha, blocking his path. "Tell you what," he said, his voice calm but firm. "If you want to leave here without paying, I'll make sure the whole town knows you lied, and I'll take my 10,000 in a different way." Winchester paused, his eyes flicking between Tommy and Martha, realizing he was being cornered. "Fine," he growled. "I'll pay you your money. But this isn't over, boy. I don't forget slights like this." As he turned to leave, Tommy stood his ground, unfazed by the threat. Martha could feel the tension in the air as the door slammed behind the banker. Tommy's eyes softened, and for the first time since they'd met, Martha saw the exhaustion on his face. He had been playing a dangerous game, but he had won, for now at least. For now, the air in the inn felt heavier after Winchester's departure, as if the storm outside had crept inside the walls. Martha stood silently, her hands pressed against the worn counter, trying to process what had just transpired. Tommy had done something she never thought possible. Winchester was cured, and the impossible had happened, but at what cost? Tommy had asked for $10,000, but Winchester, as expected, hadn't kept his word. It was no surprise. Martha knew that the powerful man would find any excuse to back out of his promise, but Tommy had been determined. The defiance in his eyes when he stood up to the banker still lingered in her mind. For a brief moment, Martha found herself feeling proud of the boy, but that pride was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. Tommy had made an enemy of the most powerful man in Dusty Creek, and she knew all too well the kind of repercussions that came with it. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her voice a whisper, as she watched Tommy stand quietly by the hearth. He didn't respond right away, his face reflecting a quiet determination. He wasn't looking at her, but rather out the window, as if watching the rain fall would answer questions he couldn't put into words. "I'll be fine," Tommy said eventually, his voice steady but distant. "I did what had to be done." Martha nodded but didn't press him. She had no idea what kind of life Tommy had lived before arriving at the inn, but it was clear to her now that this was a boy who understood the weight of the world on his shoulders. But as the hours passed, the unease in Martha's chest grew. There was no doubt in her mind that Winchester wouldn't forget the insult. The man was dangerous, and now that Tommy had exposed him for what he truly was, a coward hiding behind money and power, Martha feared that retaliation was inevitable. The door to the inn creaked open late that afternoon, and Martha looked up quickly. She had half hoped it was someone bringing the money Winchester had promised. Instead, it was a familiar face, Giuseppe Rossi, the town's barber. His round face was flushed from the storm, his eyes full of concern. "Martha," he said, his voice low, "I heard what happened." Martha didn't need to ask how he'd heard. News spread through Dusty Creek faster than wildfire, and it wasn't long before whispers about Tommy's confrontation with Winchester had reached every corner of the town. "I didn't ask for it," Martha replied quietly, her eyes on Tommy, who still hadn't turned to face them. Giuseppe looked from her to Tommy, his gaze lingering on the boy's still form. "You know Winchester won't let this go, right? He'll come after you. He won't forget the insult." Martha felt the familiar pit of dread grow deeper. "I know. I've seen men like him before," Giuseppe continued, lowering his voice further. "He won't stop until he gets what he wants. And now he's got a reason to make your life even harder." Martha didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She'd known what kind of man Winchester was long before this incident, but hearing it from Giuseppe made it feel real and more terrifying. The town might have turned a blind eye to his cruelty in the past, but now the balance had shifted. Tommy had made his stand, but in doing so he had placed both of them in a dangerous position. Martha felt responsible for the boy, and yet she couldn't bring herself to regret giving him a home. He was kind, intelligent, and wise beyond his years, but she knew the reality of the world they lived in, and that world was unforgiving. Just as Martha opened her mouth to respond to Giuseppe, a sound from the doorway caught her attention. It was a man in a dark coat, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud. "Winchester's hired 2 bounty hunters," the man said flatly. "They'll be here by sundown." Martha felt her stomach drop. The weight of the situation had just become all too real. The town, divided between those who resented Winchester and those who were afraid of him, was now on the brink of something much worse. She looked at Tommy, who for the first time since his arrival seemed uncertain. His usual calm composure had cracked, and in its place was a quiet tension she couldn't ignore. "What do we do now?" Martha asked, her voice almost a whisper. Tommy didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to face the window, his eyes scanning the town outside, as if trying to predict the storm that was surely about to come. "We fight," he said finally, his voice unwavering. "We don't have a choice." And in that moment, Martha realized that Tommy was no longer just the boy she had taken in. He was something more now, a protector, a force in his own right. The battle was just beginning. The evening came quickly, and with it, the air in Dusty Creek felt thick with tension. Word had spread quickly through the town, and already Martha could feel the weight of the storm that was about to hit. People were taking sides, divided between their long-held fear of Samuel Winchester and the growing admiration for the boy who had stood up to him. It was as though the town had been waiting for someone to challenge the oppressive force that Winchester had been for years. Martha's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside. Her heart skipped a beat as the door creaked open. It was Giuseppe again, his face grim, his hands clutching a piece of paper. "Giuseppe?" Martha asked, her voice tense. She hadn't expected him to return so soon. "I've got word," he said, holding up the paper. "Winchester's hired 2 bounty hunters, Jack Mason and Red Thompson. I've heard of them before. They're ruthless." Martha's stomach tightened. The name Jack Mason sent a chill down her spine. He was a notorious bounty hunter, known for his cold, methodical approach to his work. Red Thompson, his partner, was just as dangerous. The 2 of them together were enough to make even the toughest men tremble. "Where are they?" Tommy asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of determination. Giuseppe lowered his voice. "They're already on their way here. They'll be in town by sundown." Martha turned to Tommy, her heart racing. The boy had been so confident earlier, but now she saw the change in him. The fight that was coming wasn't just against one man. It was against a system that had kept Dusty Creek under Winchester's thumb for far too long. "We need to prepare," Tommy said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "They won't just come for me, they'll come for both of us." The weight of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. Martha had known this day would come, but she had hoped it would be far off in the future. Now, with the bounty hunters on their way, it felt as though everything was falling apart at once. "We don't have much time," Giuseppe said. "The townspeople are already starting to pick sides. Some are supporting you, but others are scared of what Winchester might do if you stand up to him. You need to be ready." Martha felt the overwhelming pressure of the situation. She had never been one for confrontation, especially in a town where the rules were dictated by men like Winchester. But Tommy had given her no choice. The moment she'd opened her door to him, her life had changed. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore. She was fighting for him and for something bigger. "We'll stand our ground," Tommy said, his voice steady as if the decision had already been made long before now. "We'll show them that we won't be intimidated." Martha wasn't sure if she could fight the fear gnawing at her insides, but she knew one thing. Tommy was right. They didn't have a choice. If they didn't stand up now, everything would be lost. As the rain continued to pour outside, the storm that had been brewing for so long was finally here, and there was no turning back. Later that evening, the door to the inn creaked open once more. This time, it was Sarah Mackenzie, the town's teacher, who stepped inside. Her face was pale and her eyes were wide with worry. "I heard," she said, her voice shaky. "I heard about the bounty hunters. You're not alone in this, Martha." Martha looked up, surprised by the teacher's words. Sarah had always been kind to her, but she had kept to herself, rarely getting involved in the town's politics. The fact that she was here now, offering support, spoke volumes. "We'll fight them together," Sarah continued, her eyes filled with resolve. "I'm not afraid of Winchester or anyone he sends. We need to show the town that we're not just going to cower in fear anymore." Tommy stepped forward, his gaze meeting Sarah's. "We'll need everyone who's willing to stand with us. We can't do this alone." Sarah nodded. "We'll gather a group, those who aren't afraid to stand up. We'll make sure those bounty hunters know they're not welcome here." Martha felt a surge of emotion. In that moment, she realized just how much had changed since Tommy had arrived. He had brought more than just hope. He had sparked something in the people of Dusty Creek. They weren't going to just let Winchester and his hired guns trample over them anymore. "We have to prepare for them," Martha said, her voice stronger now. "We'll need supplies, we'll need barricades, and we'll need a plan." Tommy's eyes shone with determination. "We'll make sure they can't touch us. We'll show them that Dusty Creek belongs to the people, not to a tyrant like Winchester." As the night fell, the town of Dusty Creek began to stir with an energy it hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, Martha felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for something worth saving, and no matter how dark the storm might get, she wasn't going to face it alone. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Dusty Creek was divided in ways it hadn't been in decades. The once quiet streets buzzed with whispered conversations, uncertain alliances, and cautious glances. The town had been forced to choose: align with Samuel Winchester, the powerful and feared banker, or stand with Martha and the boy who had dared to defy him. Martha sat by the fire in the inn, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't help but feel the unease of what was to come. The bounty hunters would arrive soon, and despite the support she had received from people like Giuseppe and Sarah, she knew the road ahead would be treacherous. "Everyone's waiting for the word," Giuseppe said quietly, his voice tense with concern as he stood in the doorway. The townsfolk, some of them want to fight, but others are too scared of Winchester's reach. You know what he's capable of." Martha nodded, rubbing her tired eyes. She had seen the fear in the eyes of many, even those who had once considered themselves her friends, but the fear was real. Winchester had always been a man who got what he wanted, and he didn't do it through kindness. "There are more with us than against us," Tommy said from across the room. He was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic motion calm and deliberate. "We'll make sure they know that." His quiet confidence was both comforting and unnerving. For a boy so young, he had a way of seeing things clearly, even when the world around him was filled with chaos and uncertainty. Martha wondered, not for the first time, what kind of life Tommy had led before arriving in Dusty Creek. What had shaped him into the person he was today? Giuseppe stepped closer, his face grim. "You're not wrong, Tommy. There's a lot of anger in this town. A lot of people tired of living under Winchester's thumb, but they won't fight unless they know they're not alone." Martha took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. "We need to unite the town, get everyone who's willing to fight ready. The more of us there are, the better chance we'll have." "We'll be ready," Sarah Mackenzie added, stepping into the room with a determined look on her face. "I've spoken to a few others. There are more than a few who are fed up with Winchester's ways." "Good," Martha said, her voice steady. "We'll need all the help we can get. This isn't just about protecting me or Tommy, this is about the whole town. Dusty Creek is ours, not his." Tommy glanced up from the knife he was sharpening, his eyes meeting Martha's. "They'll see it, Martha. The people who are scared, the ones who don't know what to do, they'll come around when they see the strength in us. In you." Martha smiled faintly, but she felt the weight of those words more than she wanted to admit. Tommy believed in her. The town believed in her too, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was hanging by a fragile thread. Outside, the wind began to pick up, howling through the cracks in the inn's walls. The storm that had raged earlier seemed to be picking up again, as if mirroring the brewing conflict in the town. Martha had always found solace in the rain, but tonight it felt like a harbinger of what was to come. Giuseppe gave a quick nod. "I'll go round up some of the others. We'll set up a meeting spot." Martha nodded in return, her thoughts swirling. She was grateful for the support, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to guarantee their safety. They could barricade themselves in, but would that really keep the bounty hunters out? Would the people of Dusty Creek really stand up to the tyranny that had ruled their lives for so long? "I'll be back soon," Giuseppe said, his voice low. "Get ready. It won't be long before they come for us." After he left, a heavy silence filled the room. Martha sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. She could feel the tension mounting, the unease in her bones growing with every passing minute. Tommy, ever calm, placed the knife down and turned his gaze to the window, his eyes scanning the darkening streets. "They'll be here soon," he said, his tone unshaken. "And when they come, we'll be ready." Martha nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her insides. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that the people of Dusty Creek could stand up to the ones who thought they could control them. As the minutes stretched into hours, Martha's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of distant footsteps approaching the inn. Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, knowing this moment would define everything. The door creaked open again, but this time it was not a friend who entered. Standing in the doorway was a tall man with a stern face and a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He was dressed in dark clothes, and the gleam of a rifle was visible beneath his coat. "I'm Jack Mason," the man said flatly, his voice low and dangerous. "You've got a problem, Miss Sullivan, and I'm here to fix it." Jack Mason's presence in the doorway sent a chill through the room. His cold eyes scanned the inn, taking in the few people who were gathered there: Martha, Tommy, Giuseppe, and Sarah. His gaze lingered briefly on Tommy, but it was clear who his target was. He had the look of a man used to getting his way, a man who didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're Martha Sullivan," Mason said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I've got a job to do, and I intend to finish it." Martha stood, her heart pounding. She had seen men like Mason before, men who didn't care about right or wrong, just power and control. Her eyes flicked to Tommy, standing close by, the calmest of them all. His eyes, usually full of unspoken wisdom, now held a quiet fire that matched the storm brewing outside. "I've been expecting you," Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "You're here for the boy, I assume." Mason's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "That's right, but I'm not here just for him. I'm here to make sure everyone remembers who runs this town. Winchester made it clear no one crosses him without consequences." Giuseppe stepped forward, his voice firm. "We're not afraid of you. We won't let you do what Winchester wants." Sarah, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "You're not welcome here, Mason. Leave now and you'll leave in one piece." Mason's gaze shifted to Sarah, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not here to make friends," he said, his voice cold as ice. "I'm here to collect, and I'm not leaving without what I came for." Tommy, who had been silent up until this moment, stepped in front of Martha, his small figure appearing almost inconsequential compared to the hulking figure of Mason. But there was no mistaking the resolve in Tommy's eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," Tommy said, his voice calm but sharp. "And neither are you." Mason's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, as if he couldn't believe the audacity of a boy so young to stand up to him. He took a step forward, his boots creaking against the floorboards. "You're not in charge here, boy. You're nothing." "I'm something you won't forget," Tommy replied, his voice unwavering. The tension in the room thickened, every moment stretching out like a taut rope ready to snap. The storm outside raged harder, the wind howling, the thunder rumbling in the distance, as if the heavens themselves were mirroring the conflict inside. Mason took another step forward, his hand resting near the grip of his holstered revolver. "You think you're a hero? You're just a boy trying to play in a game that's too big for you." Tommy's eyes never left his. "I'm not playing. I'm standing for what's right." For a moment, no one moved. The quiet stretched, every breath held in anticipation. Tommy's posture was relaxed, but there was an undeniable power in his presence, something that seemed far older than his 12 years. He wasn't just standing up to Mason, he was standing up to everything Winchester and men like him represented. Mason's eyes flickered to Martha, as if weighing his options. "You think you're safe here, Sullivan?" he sneered. "You're not. We both know how this ends. You might have a few people behind you, but they're all cowards at heart. You can't win." Martha felt a surge of anger rise within her, but she didn't speak. It was Tommy who answered. "We'll see about that," he said quietly, his words cutting through the tension. Mason's fingers twitched toward his gun. The sound of the rain against the window grew louder, the air charged with an unspoken threat. Tommy wasn't backing down, and neither was Mason. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to give. Before Mason could make his move, a sound from the street interrupted the standoff, shouts followed by the unmistakable rumble of horses' hooves. The bounty hunter paused, his hand frozen over the grip of his revolver, and turned toward the door. "Backup's here," he muttered under his breath, his eyes still on Tommy. "This isn't over, boy." Tommy didn't flinch. "It's just beginning." As Mason turned to leave, Martha felt a sudden shift in the air. He was no longer in control. The town, once cowering beneath Winchester's shadow, had started to find its voice. And Tommy, the boy who had walked into her life only days before, was the catalyst for that change. Mason's silhouette disappeared into the storm outside, and the door slammed shut behind him. For a moment everything was still. Then Tommy exhaled, the tension leaving his body in one long breath. Martha stood there, her heart still racing, but now with a sense of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "We can win this," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. Tommy looked out the window, his gaze distant, and nodded. "Yes, we can, but we'll need everyone. We fight together." And for the first time since the death of her husband, Martha realized that the fight they were about to face wasn't just about survival. It was about something more, something greater. And with Tommy by her side, she was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. The next morning, the storm that had torn through Dusty Creek the night before left the town quieter, yet no less tense. The streets were empty, save for the occasional figure glancing nervously down alleyways, wondering if the bounty hunters had returned. The people of the town had spent too long in fear of Winchester, but now with Mason's presence looming over them, the truth was hard to ignore. The winds of change were blowing, and they were going to have to decide which side of history they would stand on. Martha stood at the inn's window, looking out onto the dirt street. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy with the promise of more. The usual hum of the town had been replaced by a thick silence, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. For most of the town, that something was coming in the form of the bounty hunters. But for a few brave souls, Giuseppe, Sarah, and the others who had come together to stand against Winchester, it was the beginning of a new fight. "Are you sure you want to do this, Martha?" Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts. The schoolteacher had come to join her in the inn early that morning, after the confrontation with Mason the night before. Martha turned, giving Sarah a small, reassuring smile. "We don't have a choice. We can't let them take this town any longer." Sarah hesitated before speaking again, her voice softer. "I'm not afraid to fight, but I can't help but wonder if we're all making a mistake. What if it's too much? What if we're outnumbered?" Martha's gaze shifted to the door. She could almost feel the weight of every decision made in that moment, knowing that any misstep could cost them everything. The town had already been divided, but now it was coming down to more than just a fight for survival. This was about the future. "Then we die fighting," Martha said, her voice steady, "but we won't let them take our town without a fight. Not anymore." Tommy, who had been sitting by the hearth, watching the fire burn low, stood up slowly and walked toward the door. His quiet presence was always felt, and even now, as the tension in the room grew thicker, there was an unspoken strength about him. He turned back toward Martha and Sarah. "They'll come for us today," Tommy said, his tone calm, as though he had known this moment was inevitable. "But we have something they don't: unity. And when they see that, they'll know they can't break us." Martha smiled at him, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and fear. This boy, this child who had come from nothing, had become the symbol of resistance, and now he was about to lead them all into the fire. "Giuseppe will rally the others," Sarah said. "We'll need to make sure everyone knows where to go. We can't just hide and wait. We need a plan." Martha nodded. The people of Dusty Creek had lived under the shadow of Winchester for too long, but now that the line had been drawn, there was no turning back. As the day wore on, the town began to shift. Small groups of people, some familiar faces, others new, gathered quietly at the inn. Each one had their own reasons for standing up, but it was clear that something in Dusty Creek had changed. No longer were they simply victims of a tyrant. They were becoming something more. They were becoming a community. Giuseppe stood at the head of the gathering, his face set in determination. "We know what's coming. We can't let them take control again. We fight together, and we fight for what's ours." The townsfolk nodded, a murmur of agreement rippling through the room. Even those who had once been too afraid to speak up were now standing tall, ready to face the danger that approached them. Martha stepped forward, standing next to Tommy, her heart racing with a mixture of dread and resolve. She had never been a leader, but today, circumstances had forced her into that role. "We fight for each other," she said, her voice strong, carrying the weight of all those who had supported them. "We fight for Dusty Creek, and we will not back down." Tommy stepped forward, his small figure once again an unshakable pillar of strength. "They think they can control us, but they're wrong. We will make them see that Dusty Creek belongs to us." The group was silent for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. Then, one by one, the townsfolk began to move. Men, women, and children gathered their things, preparing for the coming fight. Outside, the first of the bounty hunters appeared on horseback, their figures dark against the stormy horizon. The sight of them sent a chill down Martha's spine, but she forced herself to stand tall. They were here, but this time it was different. This time they wouldn't be bullied into submission. The line had been drawn, and there was no going back. As the town prepared to face the coming storm, Martha stood with Tommy by her side. They were no longer just survivors. They were fighters, and they would not let their town fall without a fight. The air was thick with tension as Dusty Creek prepared for the storm that was about to hit, both from the sky and from the men who had come to claim it. The bounty hunters were close, their horses kicking up dust as they rode into town. The storm clouds above seemed to mirror the storm below, with the town on the brink of an all-out battle. Martha stood at the head of the gathering inside the inn, her heart pounding in her chest. Tommy was by her side, his steady gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting for the inevitable. The townspeople had gathered, ready to fight for their home, but Martha knew this was just the beginning. She had never imagined she would be in this position, leading a fight against the very men who had controlled their lives for so long. Giuseppe and Sarah had been instrumental in organizing the defense, but it was Tommy who had become the true leader of their group. His quiet confidence had inspired the town to take action, and now, with the bounty hunters nearing the center of Dusty Creek, the moment had come. "We don't know how long we can hold them off," Giuseppe said, his voice low but urgent as he approached Martha. "They've got the advantage, but we have something they don't, a reason to fight." Martha nodded. "We fight for each other, and we fight for the future of this town. It's not just about me or Tommy anymore. It's about Dusty Creek." The sound of hooves grew louder as the bounty hunters approached. Tommy stood tall, his eyes scanning the street outside, as if he were anticipating the exact moment they would arrive. He didn't show fear. Not once had he wavered, even as the town's fate rested on the edge of a knife. "Get ready," Tommy said quietly, turning to face the townsfolk who had gathered in the inn. "They'll be here soon, and when they come, we don't back down." Outside, the bounty hunters could be seen riding through the main street, their figures dark against the backdrop of the town. There were two of them, Jack Mason and Red Thompson, the men sent by Winchester to collect what he believed was his due. Their cold, calculating faces betrayed no hint of hesitation. They were professional, and they had no intention of being stopped by a ragtag group of townsfolk. Giuseppe led a small group to the front of the inn, where they set up makeshift barricades with wooden planks and furniture from the building. It wouldn't hold forever, but it would give them a chance to make their stand. "They're almost here," Sarah said, coming to stand beside Martha. "We need to be ready. We can't wait any longer." Martha nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. The battle for Dusty Creek was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming their dignity, their right to live free from fear. This fight would decide their future. The bounty hunters dismounted as they reached the center of town, their eyes scanning the streets, looking for any sign of resistance. The people of Dusty Creek stood at their windows and doorways, watching, waiting, but not retreating. They were done being afraid. Mason stepped forward, his hand resting near the grip of his revolver. "I know you're all hiding in here somewhere," he called out, his voice loud enough to carry. "It's over, Sullivan. You're not going to win this. We've got Winchester's backing, and you've got nothing." Martha stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "You're wrong, Mason. We've got something you'll never understand. We fight for each other, and we fight for our home. That's more powerful than any money Winchester can give you." Mason's eyes narrowed, and he drew his gun slowly, a sinister grin playing at the corners of his mouth. "You should have stayed out of this, Sullivan. Now you're going to pay the price." But before he could make another move, Tommy stepped into the open, his small figure standing firm between the bounty hunters and the townspeople. "You won't take anything from us," Tommy said, his voice carrying an unshakable certainty. Mason laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "And what are you going to do, boy? You think you can stop me?" Tommy's eyes never left Mason's. "I don't have to stop you. I just have to make sure you know we're not afraid of you." With that, Tommy turned and nodded at the townspeople who had gathered, their hands gripping rifles and makeshift weapons. A quiet murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and without another word, they raised their weapons in unity. Mason's eyes flicked around the town, realizing that this wasn't just a handful of people standing up against him, it was the entire town. And for the first time, he saw something in the eyes of the people of Dusty Creek that made him hesitate, something more powerful than any bounty, any fear. A shot rang out. It wasn't Tommy who fired, nor was it Mason's men. It was one of the townsfolk, a man who had never before lifted a gun but who now had no choice. The bullet struck the ground just in front of Mason, sending a clear message. The battle had begun. For the next few moments, everything seemed to happen in a blur. The townsfolk fought not just for their homes, but for their right to be free. The bounty hunters returned fire, but they were outnumbered, and their confidence began to waver. Tommy stood firm, watching the scene unfold around him with a calmness that only seemed to grow. Mason and Red Thompson realized they were losing ground. The townspeople, united in a way they had never been before, were pushing them back. What had begun as a fight for survival had become a fight for something much greater, a fight for dignity, for freedom. But just as it seemed like the bounty hunters might be forced to retreat, a new figure appeared in the distance, a rider, galloping quickly toward the town, the familiar figure of Winchester. Martha's heart sank as she recognized the man, knowing that this battle was far from over. The sight of Samuel Winchester riding into Dusty Creek sent a new wave of fear through the town, more chilling than the sight of the bounty hunters. The sun was now setting, casting long shadows over the battlefield, but Winchester's arrival seemed to darken the sky even further. The man who had ruled over this town with an iron fist for years had returned, and this time there was no room for compromise. Martha stood at the barricade, her heart hammering in her chest. The battle had been raging for what felt like hours, but the moment Winchester appeared on horseback, it was as if the town's resolve was tested again. He wasn't just the banker anymore. He was the embodiment of everything they had been fighting against. "Damn it," Giuseppe muttered under his breath as he looked out toward the horizon. "This is bad. He's come to finish it." Martha gripped her rifle tighter, her knuckles white. She could feel the weight of the town's future on her shoulders. If they didn't hold their ground now, if they didn't make their stand, then everything they had fought for would be lost. Dusty Creek would go back to being nothing but a town ruled by Winchester's cruelty, its people forced to bend to his will. The sound of Winchester's horse's hooves grew louder, his figure coming into sharper view. He wasn't alone. Behind him rode a dozen men, his personal enforcers, hired guns who had always done his bidding. The bounty hunters, Jack Mason and Red Thompson, had been enough to instill fear, but Winchester's presence was something else entirely. It was power, pure and unyielding. "Everyone get ready," Martha called to the townsfolk around her. "Hold your ground. This is our town, and we're not going to give it up without a fight." The townspeople tightened their grips on their weapons, their faces set in determination. No one flinched as Winchester and his men drew nearer. The tension was palpable in the air, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. Winchester pulled his horse to a stop just a few yards away from the barricade, his cold eyes scanning the faces of the people who had defied him. His gaze lingered on Tommy, standing resolute at the front of the group. The boy was everything Winchester despised. Young, defiant, and standing in the way of everything he believed he was owed. "So this is what it's come to," Winchester said, his voice carrying over the battlefield. "A bunch of farmers and shopkeepers thinking they can stand up to me. You've all lost your minds." Martha's jaw clenched. "We're not afraid of you anymore, Winchester. We won't be your slaves." The people behind her murmured in agreement, but Winchester's smirk never faltered. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, and the idea that these ordinary townsfolk could challenge him seemed laughable to him. "I gave you a chance, Sullivan," he said, his voice dripping with venom, "but you had to make a fool of me. Now you'll pay the price." With a flick of his wrist, he signaled for his men to dismount, and the air seemed to grow colder as the group of men fanned out, surrounding the townsfolk. The threat was clear. If the people of Dusty Creek didn't submit, they would be crushed. Martha could see the fear in the eyes of some of the townsfolk now. This was not just a standoff between two sides. It was a battle for their lives, and Winchester had the power to destroy them all. He could wipe out their homes, their livelihoods, their hopes for a future. But as she looked around at the faces of the townspeople, she saw something that hadn't been there before. A quiet determination. They weren't just afraid anymore, they were angry. They were ready. Tommy stepped forward, his small form moving with the same unshakable confidence that had gotten them this far. "You're wrong, Winchester," he said, his voice carrying across the tense silence. "This isn't about you. It's about all of us. You've taken enough from us, and now we're taking it back." Winchester's expression darkened, his jaw tightening in anger. "A child thinks he can lecture me? You're just a boy who doesn't know his place." Tommy's eyes never wavered. "You've taken enough from everyone in this town, but you can't take us anymore. We won't let you." The words hung in the air, sharp and clear, and for a moment, it seemed like the world held its breath. Winchester's grip on his reins tightened, his face twisting in rage, but there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of doubt. Tommy wasn't afraid, and in that moment, neither was Martha. "You'll regret this, boy," Winchester spat. "You can't win. I will burn this town to the ground before I let you take it from me." But before he could say anything further, a loud voice cut through the air. Sarah Mackenzie, standing tall behind the barricade with a rifle in hand. "We're not afraid of you anymore, Winchester," Sarah shouted. "You don't own us. We're not your property." The townspeople around Sarah echoed her words, their voices rising in defiance. Martha felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was everyone's. The town had found its voice, and with it the strength to fight for something worth saving. Winchester's face twisted in fury as he saw the resolve in the eyes of the people standing before him. He raised his hand, signaling to his men to advance. "Then let's see if you can keep this fight up," Winchester said coldly. The first shot rang out. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets of Dusty Creek as the battle for the town began in earnest. It was no longer just about survival. It was about standing for what was right, and for the first time, Martha felt a sense of certainty in her heart. No matter the outcome, they had already won something far greater than they had ever expected: freedom. The fight had begun, but this time, they would not back down. The deafening crack of gunfire reverberated through Dusty Creek, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the town moments before. In an instant, chaos erupted. The first shot came from one of Winchester's men, a cold, calculated attempt to intimidate, but it did more than that. It ignited something in the people of Dusty Creek. The townsfolk, who had once cowered in fear, now stood their ground. They fired back, not in wild desperation, but with a quiet, fierce determination. Their aim was true, their resolve even stronger. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything they had lost and everything they could gain. Martha's heart raced as she crouched behind the barricade with Tommy at her side. The sound of gunfire was so close now that she could feel the vibration in her chest. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. For a moment, she thought of John, her late husband, and how he would have wanted to protect this town, protect her. She could almost hear his voice urging her to stand firm, to never back down. Through the smoke, she caught a glimpse of Winchester. His face twisted in fury as he barked orders at his men. They had clearly underestimated the strength of the town's resistance. He hadn't expected this level of defiance, this level of unity among the people he had oppressed for so long. "You're wasting your time, Sullivan," Winchester shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "You're all dead if you don't surrender now." Martha's eyes locked with Tommy's, and for a moment the world seemed to slow. His steady gaze, unwavering in the face of danger, gave her the strength she needed. "We're not surrendering, Winchester," Tommy called back, his voice steady but filled with a quiet fire. "We've already won, you just don't know it yet." Tommy's words rang out across the battlefield, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in Winchester's eyes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even doubt, but it was something else, something that Martha couldn't quite put her finger on. For the first time, she saw that Winchester wasn't the unbeatable tyrant he'd once seemed. The fight raged on for what felt like hours, but as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, something started to shift. The bounty hunters, who had been so confident in their ability to control the town, began to falter. They were outnumbered, and the townspeople were no longer afraid. Giuseppe fired a shot from behind a barrel, hitting one of Winchester's men in the shoulder. The man staggered back, cursing, and the other bounty hunters hesitated. "Hold your ground!" Martha called out, her voice clear and commanding. "We fight together." And they did. One by one, the townsfolk stood taller, their resolve solidifying with every shot fired. The barricades held, the shots rang true, and for every man who fell on Winchester's side, there were 2 more townsfolk rising to take their place. In the midst of the chaos, Tommy darted from cover to cover, always staying low, always moving with purpose. Martha watched him, her heart swelling with pride. He wasn't just fighting for himself, or for the town. He was fighting for the future, for everything they could build if they survived this. And then, as if it was the final stroke of fate, it happened. Winchester's horse reared up, startled by the gunfire, throwing him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind from him, and he staggered to his feet, fury written across his face. He reached for his revolver, but before he could aim it, a shot rang out. It wasn't from one of his men. It came from Sarah Mackenzie, standing in the center of the street, her rifle aimed steady, her expression grim. "You've lost, Winchester," she said coldly, her voice echoing across the battlefield. "This town isn't yours anymore." Winchester froze, his eyes darting between Sarah, the townsfolk, and Tommy, who was watching him with a look of unshakable determination. For the first time, Samuel Winchester realized that he was no longer in control. The people he had tormented for years had found their courage, and with it, they had taken back the town he had stolen from them. His expression darkened, his hand trembling as he lowered his gun. He knew the fight was lost, but his pride, his arrogance kept him from admitting it. He turned, stumbling as he made his way toward his remaining men. "We'll finish this," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "You'll regret this day." But his words fell on deaf ears. His men, seeing the tides of the battle turn, hesitated. One by one, they started to back away. Some dropped their weapons, unwilling to continue fighting for a man they had once feared, but now saw for what he truly was: weak, desperate, and broken. With his own men turning their backs on him, Winchester had no choice but to retreat. His figure disappeared into the smoke, the last of his enforcers following behind him, leaving Dusty Creek to the people who had taken it back. The battle was over. As the dust settled and the echoes of gunfire faded, Martha felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Her arms were trembling from the weight of the battle, but there was no time to rest. She looked around at the townsfolk, their faces lit with exhaustion, but also with the unmistakable light of victory. Tommy stood beside her, his eyes scanning the streets, making sure no one was left standing in their way. "It's over," Martha whispered, the words tasting sweet on her tongue. Tommy turned to her, a small but triumphant smile on his face. "We did it," he said simply. Martha smiled back, feeling the weight of the moment, and for the first time since John had died, she felt hope, a hope that together they could rebuild Dusty Creek, stronger and freer than ever before. But even as the sun began to set on their victory, Martha knew this was just the beginning. They had fought for their freedom, and now it was time to build the future they deserved. And with Tommy by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. The morning after the battle was quiet, the kind of stillness that only follows the storm of a long-fought battle. The sun had risen over Dusty Creek, casting a warm golden light over the town that had, just hours ago, been filled with the sounds of gunfire and shouts. Now, the streets were empty, save for the few brave souls who had stayed behind to rebuild what was broken and clean up what remained of the chaos. Martha stood at the window of the inn, looking out over the town she had fought to save. The air was crisp, a refreshing change from the suffocating tension of the previous days. The clouds had cleared, leaving only a faint trace of the storm that had swept through Dusty Creek. For the first time in what felt like years, Martha allowed herself a breath of relief. The battle was over. Samuel Winchester and his men had been driven out, their grip on the town shattered. The people of Dusty Creek had stood their ground, and they had won. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Sarah Mackenzie's voice broke through her thoughts as she entered the room, standing beside Martha at the window. Like we're finally free. Martha nodded, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape. The town was still standing, despite everything it had endured. There were repairs to be made, wounds to heal, but the spirit of the town had survived. It wasn't just a physical victory, it was a victory for their hearts and minds. We have a lot of work ahead of us, Martha said quietly, but we'll do it. We've all earned the right to live freely now. Sarah smiled, her expression softening. And we'll do it together. For the first time, I think the town really understands what that means. Tommy appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was still calm, as if the events of the past days hadn't changed him at all. If anything, his quiet strength seemed to have grown in the aftermath of the battle. He walked over to Martha, standing beside her with the same quiet confidence that had led them through the fight. "It's over," he said simply, his voice steady. Martha looked down at him, her heart swelling with pride. In the chaos of the battle, she had realized something she hadn't before. This boy had transformed her life in ways she never expected. Tommy wasn't just a child who had come to her for shelter. He had become the heart of Dusty Creek's resistance, the one who had brought hope when there seemed to be none. "It's over," she agreed, her voice filled with a sense of finality. "Now we can rebuild," Tommy added, his eyes meeting hers. Together, Martha smiled, the weight of the past few months finally lifting from her shoulders. The town was no longer in the shadow of Winchester's cruelty. They were free, and with that freedom came the chance to build something new, something better. As the day wore on, people began to emerge from their homes, hesitantly at first, but with more certainty as time passed. The streets, once silent with fear, were filled with conversation and the sound of hammers and saws as the people of Dusty Creek worked together to repair the damage done by the battle. Giuseppe, his usual boisterous self, came up to Martha with a grin. "Looks like we've got a long road ahead of us, but I've never seen a town so full of life," he said, his eyes scanning the busy street. Martha nodded, her smile wide. "And it's our town now. The future is ours to make." As she watched the townsfolk begin the work of rebuilding, a sense of peace settled over her. Dusty Creek had been broken, yes, but it had not been defeated. It had endured, and now it was stronger than ever. Tommy walked up beside her, looking out over the town. "We did it," he said softly. Martha placed a hand on his shoulder, her heart full. "We did, and it was worth every moment." For a long while they stood there in silence, watching the town come back to life. In the days that followed, Dusty Creek slowly but surely began to heal. The people who had once feared for their futures now stood taller, stronger, and more united than ever before. They worked together to rebuild homes, businesses, and trust, both in themselves and in each other. Martha's Inn, once a symbol of her solitude and grief, became a place of gathering, where people could come together, share stories, and celebrate the new life they were building. It was a place of hope, not just for Martha, but for everyone in Dusty Creek. Tommy, too, found his place in the town. He continued to help with the repairs, and slowly he started to teach others what he had learned from his grandmother, passing down the knowledge of medicine and healing that had once saved his life. His presence in Dusty Creek became more than just a symbol of survival. It was a reminder of the power of hope, the strength of community, and the possibility of redemption. The town had found its new purpose, and for Martha, standing in the midst of it all, she knew that the fight for Dusty Creek had been worth it. They had faced their darkest hour, and now they were walking into a future full of promise. As the sun set over the town, Martha stood with Tommy, Sarah, Giuseppe, and the rest of the townsfolk, looking out over the land they had saved. Dusty Creek was no longer just a place on a map. It was home, and it was theirs. Together, they had built something new. Together, they had found hope, and together they would face whatever the future held.